How do special interests influence trade policy? Is Milton Friedman making a comeback? And why is milk never on sale? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from a fancy Washington, D.C. steakhouse where the trade lobbyists are ready to cash in on 4 more years of protectionism. Our guest today is a returning guest on Econception. It's Scott Lincicome from the Cato Institute. He is the Vice President of General Economics and Trade there. And that's the only Cato Institute reference that I want to make in this podcast because I brought Scott on. We can listen to the first episode where we really talk about sort of the economics of trade specifically, and we do so from a free market point of view. But I brought Scott on this time because I wanted to talk about how he got to this place where he supports free trade. And it's not because he was mainlining Milton Friedman. It is not because he was reading a ton of stuff that groups like the Cato Institute were putting out. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We encourage that. But that's not the reason he came here. He got to this position because he worked in international trade and he saw how it actually works. And from the inside was able to say, this stuff is crazy. We need to get government out of this. And so thanks for coming back, Scott, to talk about it.
Thanks for having me. It's like a PTSD session we're about to have. It's great.
Yeah. So I guess, first of all, just fill listeners in a little bit on your professional background before you got to Cato.
Right. So I actually got my start after college as an intern at Cato. But at that time, I thought I wanted to be a constitutional lawyer. I knew I was going to go back to law school at some point, and I wanted to take a little time off. And so I interned in the Constitutional Studies Center. They didn't have any jobs for me, so I ended up in the trade team at Cato. I was a research assistant. And then, I started to kind of learn a little bit about trade theory. I knew nothing about trade or economics or any of that stuff, really. I mean, I was a classic political science, liberal arts guy. And I realized I really liked it. And so I went back to law school and after being an RA at Cato for a little bit and became an international trade attorney, where I practiced international trade law for right around 17 years after that, before pulling the plug on the big law career and putting on, getting a pipe and my tweed jacket with elbow patches and coming back to Cato and being a full-time academic. So that's where I am today.
So a lot of times the dividing line in the trade debate is actually between economists and lawyers. A lot of time the economists are the free traders and the lawyers are the protectionists.
Yeah.
You were a lawyer and you're not a protectionist. What was it about your experience that led you to the opposite conclusion that is common among people like, say, Robert Lighthizer, Donald Trump's trade representative, who was a trade lawyer?
Yeah. So, certainly part of it was having this sort of natural libertarian streak. That's actually how I ended up at Cato. Cato was recommended to me by a family friend who kind of saw how I thought and acted. I was always kind of an individualistic guy. And so I had that background and then had some experience as a research assistant. So I had that frame of reference when I got to then inside the machine and got to watch how our trade laws are actually applied, how they're created, and who wins and loses in all of this. And the truth is that it is light years away from the rather simplistic debate you see today between free traders and protectionists, and certainly a light years away from this idea that, we have a trade deficit and we'll just slap tariffs on stuff and it'll all work out, or, that kind of stuff. It was, really, we have this system of trade remedies, so anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties that are administered at the administrative level and are just insanely complex. And insanely protectionist and yet are done under this kind of guise of fair trade and the rest. And so really, I got to observe from the inside out that laws supposedly protecting American businesses from unfair trade were themselves highly unfair. They had been written by folks in the steel industry, guys like Bob Lighthizer, politicians that cater to them. And they were totally rigged to generate duties, even where things like dumping and predatory pricing and the rest didn't actually happen. So I spent years getting really radicalized by watching our trade remedies system work in practice, where you had companies, whether they were foreign exporters or American importers, whether they were, manufacturers or retailers or wholesalers, caught up in this system and utterly powerless to fight it. And so you would have American companies that, for example, would say, well, we just bought from this company in Mexico or Japan or wherever last year. Why are we now paying for duties on stuff we bought a year ago? And we had to explain, well, that's how the system, it's actually retroactive, how the duties are applied. It's all this crazy stuff. And so, you had situations where small companies in particular were getting bankrupted by retroactive duties. The foreign exporters, like, we're not dumping at all. We're literally just selling into the market according to the, we're price takers, not price makers. Doesn't matter. That's not how the law works. And you had situations as well where bureaucrats, where it was very Kafkaesque, and you watched as the domestic industry's interests were promoted. There was no neutral arbiter in all of this. It was very much, again, the system and the bureaucrats administering these rules were very much biased in favor of the domestic industry. And so from the outside, there's broad political support for this regime. And yet from the inside, you saw how it was an absolute farce. And the people who benefited were, well, first, all the lawyers. I mean, it makes perfect sense why trade lawyers, for the most part, like our trade laws, because it is a money-generating machine, unlike few others. Once duties are in place, you have a review every year, and it's just a kind of a perpetual money machine. But also, certainly, there are some domestic companies like U.S. Steel that become very, very good at using the system to take out their competition, but also to effectively gain market power over their customers. So you heard stories about how after these duties are put in place, the suppliers like U.S. Steel would just, break their contracts and say, okay, well, you don't have any alternative supply now, so we're going to change the deal. And so you really, and then I think the other really egregious examples are where companies would actually, American companies would use the system against their American competition. So you would have two companies, one imports from Vietnam, the other one imports from China. And so the one that imports from Vietnam will file a case only against Chinese imports while maintaining its domestic supply. You see this all the time. It's happening right now with solar panels. There's a big solar panels case, and it's a Korean company in the United States that filed the case against everybody except Korea. I mean, this is how it works. So I did this a lot, and then that was the first 15 years. But even then, it was a pretty much quasi-judicial administrative process. I mean, it was bad, but it was doable. And then came the Trump years. And this was what really pushed everything over the edge, because you had a series of new tariffs implemented that were even more ridiculous than anything we had been dealing with in previous years. Because at least the trade remedy system there's detailed regulations, there's tons of court precedent, all this stuff. Whereas the Trump era tariffs, I mean, it was just law of the horse, man. There was absolutely no rules. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody inside the government, nobody outside the government. And it became, I mean, every day was an adventure, and not in a good way. And of course, certain times policy was set via tweet by the president always, of course, on a Friday evening. I had a glass of wine in my hand, and the next thing you know, there's a whole new trade regime erupting. The whole thing was just absolutely crazy.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think one of the things to point out is that for all of the talk among Donald Trump and his supporters about the deep state, which they believe to be arrayed against them. And I think in some cases, there's plenty of evidence that the bureaucracy has interests of its own, right? And uses those interests for political ends. I don't think that's a ridiculous criticism per se. But on this trade issue, the deep state's all over it. I mean, they're absolutely everywhere. You have this whole process takes place largely within the Beltway in Washington, D.C. It takes place in very, very complicated administrative rulemaking processes that ordinary voters and just Americans who might be interested in following this cannot possibly comprehend. No. And as you said, even people in other parts of the government and the people that are working on the cases have a hard time comprehending. And we're supposed to believe somehow that that system is going to serve the interests of the American people writ large. And that seems like a really big inconsistency to me. What do you think is behind sort of this impulse to say that protectionism is looking out for the American people when it resembles the worst practices of bureaucratic overreach that harms the American people?
Yeah, and industry capture as well, right? I mean, it's just an entire profession or entire area of the law that really reflects primarily the interests of a few domestic industries, steel, textiles, and then there's big dairy and of course big sugar. But and I mean, we have an office of textiles. I mean, the United States, $26 trillion economy, killing it on AI and all these other things. Our main manufacturers are in things like aerospace and transportation and satellites and the rest. Yeah, we have an office of textiles. Like sure, right, of course. And steel is the classic example of just capture everywhere. The previous Trump administration had a large chunk of its trade policy making apparatus came from the steel industry, or in Bob Lighthizer case, represented the steel industry for decades. And so, yeah, it's the idea that these are neutral, high-minded policymakers out for the public interest and national security and the rest of that is just, it's ridiculous. I mean, it's really just a good old-fashioned interest group politics and public choice theory and all those things that we libertarians talk about. But again, you see it in practice. I mean, when you're on the inside doing this stuff, it's like every day feels like you're in an Ayn Rand novel or something. I mean, it's just so mind-blowing. But then the other thing that I think is really important is, like you said, the minutia of all of it. Things are intentionally opaque in ways that really are kind of mind-blowing. I mentioned this retroactive duty process, but this is a system that is, by the domestic petitioner's lawyer's own admission, a intentional non-tariff barrier on imports. Because once you're caught up in the system, so once there's an affirmative trade remedies order in place, you kind of never get out. These things can last for decades upon decades, and you only know the final duty rate you pay if you're an importer. So let's say you're American home builder and you're buying lumber from Canada, heaven forbid, and you think you're going to have to pay a 10% duty on those imports. So you import tons of that lumber over a year. Well, then there's this review process that actually says, you know what? Actually, the level of dumping or the level of subsidization was 30%. So suddenly your tariff bill triples if you're that importer. So what does that do, right? You simply don't import from Canada anymore. You buy higher priced product in the United States or elsewhere. But for a lot of companies, like I said, when that tariff bill comes, you just go out of business. And these are American companies, or at least US based companies that are doing this. And none of this, again, makes any sense. It is not this fair and uniform and neutral process. And then I think the other thing, though, is the absolute chaos that occurred when a lot of these same things happened for the Trump tariffs, because those, again, were a different process, very much seat of the pants. And you had tariffs entering into force in a very short period of time, which, okay, short period of time, good, efficient government. The problem is that companies in the United States had product, steel and aluminum or stuff from China or wherever, literally on a ship already heading to the United States. They had already bought this stuff. They had already paid for this stuff. And then it arrives and suddenly they get a bill for millions of dollars more. And I represented some US-based companies that dealt with exactly these types of things. So it's insanity that this is how our trade laws work. And this, it not only gets to kind of the cronyism and bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff, but I hope for the listeners, it really undermines the idea that this is a coherent, strategic, targeted approach to trade policy making. This is not, the most brilliant minds crafting a optimal tariff theory on paper or whatever. It is a very kludgy, very messy, very, I hate to use the word corrupt, but at least very biased process that ends up with a lot of unintended consequences and collateral damage.
Yeah, I think it's if it's not corrupt, it's corrupted, and it is also corruptible. And that is something we should be on the lookout for. A while back, I had Ed Gresser on the show. He did this from the government side in the USTR's office. And it was very much involved in a lot of these same kinds of issues. And one of the things that he was talking about is how when the Trump tariffs came on in 2018, they were expecting to get exemption requests from U.S. businesses. They always get exemption requests from U.S. businesses because they don't want to pay the tax. And so there's a process they can go through to do that. What they weren't expecting was that they got 52,000 exemption requests from U.S. businesses. And at that point, you have to wonder, how many U.S. businesses have to say, actually, this policy is hurting us before we conclude that actually the policy is just hurting the U.S.? Because that's not a case of special interests asking for exemptions, right? When you've got 52,000 companies all going out and saying, hey, look, this is really not going to be good for us. It's really hard to come back and say that it's supporting the U.S. And I think that's where the nationalist impulse among a lot of protectionists should really come into question, because as you said before, you have situations where foreign companies actually use the system to their advantage because it's so complicated. And if they can hire good enough lawyers, they can get it to work for their advantage too. So that's not great. But also from a national security perspective, we often hear national security justifications for tariffs. I've talked about those with Samuel Gregg on the show before. But one of the things that people say is, look, we need to be able to protect our industries from our enemies. But you have an interesting case that you worked on about steel, where you're trying to convince the government that actually our allies are not our enemies. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So there's two things going on. First, I want to talk about the exclusions as well, but we'll start with the exemptions in steel. Yeah. So I represented some steel makers from in close allied countries abroad that were trying to convince the U.S. government that they were not a national security threat to the United States. I mean, these are NATO allies. They had some of the closest defense-related treaties and defense-related procurement agreements, meaning that the two countries shared the strictest of defense technologies, trying to convince the U.S. government that these products could not, and they were not threatening U.S. national security. And relatedly, these products weren't even in a type of steel that might have had some sort of defense-related nexus, right? Because you could make an argument that even steel from Canada, from our closest allies, might be an issue if it's a steel that we need in certain defense goods and we need a certain onshore production. No, that's what we're talking about. That we're talking about stuff. It's like commodity grade steel. There was no security nexus coming from close allies, and yet here they were basically saying we're treaty allies. It's going to be fine, and at the same time, of course, the defense secretary in the United States at the time, Jim Mattis, literally wrote he had no concerns about American steel production and capacity. Defense Department only needed, per his estimates, about 3% of total U.S. steel production. Even in a time of all-out war, they were like, maybe 5% we might need. So you could shut down 95% of U.S. steel production and DOD would be fine, right? So these were not a national security threat situation. And yet, what'd we get? We got blanket global tariffs on everybody, closest allies and China and everybody else, and all grades of steel. It was not this well thought out process. At the end of the day, it was buying steel votes in Pennsylvania, and that's why, of course, the tariffs still exist. It's because everybody needs to win Pennsylvania, and you got a bunch of steel jobs in Pennsylvania. So that's what you have. This is not strategic trade policy, but it's of course
strategic political policy, though.
Right. Well, yeah,
sure. Yeah.
And that gets to the exclusion part, because that's the other thing that I did a lot of work in that in my last few years before leaving the law. And you had not only a exclusion process for the China imports, and that was at USTR, what Ed Gresser worked on. You had a even bigger exclusion process or at least more convoluted process in the Department of Commerce for the steel and aluminum tariffs. And so I represented a company that imported aluminum. This was an American manufacturer, or at least US-based manufacturer, and they needed a certain type of aluminum that wasn't even made in the United States. It was, again, a situation where they had orders on the books from months before the tariffs ever went into force, and yet they were then on the hook for duties. So they went to the government, hat in hand. I mean, this is also, talk about making your libertarian senses go nuts. I mean, you just had a bunch of private companies basically begging the government for relief, right? That's never good. But this company had a perfectly viable excuse. I can't get the product here. It's coming again from a close ally. Please give me my money back, because again, they were already on the hook for these duties. So we realized through this process, there wasn't a process in place for fair trade zones, which is where they were located. So that was being made up on the fly. There wasn't a clear process for these refunds, and you had to reapply every year. And it was an absolute convoluted mess. I mean, it was problem after problem after problem. Nobody in the government knew what was going on. We, of course, didn't know what was going on. And just as depressingly, we realized very early on in all of this that the best way you could get your exclusion approved was to hire a lobbyist. This is not about the law. This is not about the economics. It's not about national security. It's about who you knew. And for the next couple of years, I found myself for the first time as a lawyer leading off with, okay, first thing we need to do is get you a lobbyist. Who do you know in the Trump administration? And now we actually have research from several economic studies have looked at this and found there is a quite tight relationship between companies that donated to Republicans or had other connections to the Trump administration during that period. So quite close connection between their relationships and their ability to secure exclusions and so tariff-free shipping, and for both China and for the metals. The independent, I guess it was the Government Accountability Office, and an Inspector General looked at these processes for exclusion and said, "Ooh, these are pretty rough." Why were they pretty rough? Well, beyond the nobody knows anything issue of it just being a giant mess, and beyond it being extremely opaque, so you had no idea how the decisions were being made. Not even kind of the low-level bureaucrats you talked to understood how that was being made. But the other really big problem was, at least for the steel and aluminum tariffs, you had the U.S. steel industry getting to weigh in on whether an exclusion should be granted for their competitors. So this was, it's like when you have licensing boards that are, of course, staffed up by, a bunch of dentists who have to decide on whether they should allow an out-of-state competitor. What do? Right? No, that's that license denied. You had a lot of that too. So it was, the whole thing was just one libertarian nightmare after another. But more seriously, just case after case after case, you saw that this really belied the idea that we were engaging in smart trade policy. Trump always likes to say, "Oh, I'm smart. This is smart trade," all that kind of stuff. Nah, man, it was just good old kludgy bureaucracy at it again.
So we hear a lot that the free trade position is the one that's supported by the Washington establishment, and that it's the outsider upstarts who oppose it. And so I'm just curious, in your experience, who makes more money in Washington, D.C., international trade lawyers or free trade supporting scholars?
Well, I'll put it this way. I did not move to Cato and get a big pay raise. Yeah, the reality is that the trade bar does very well. There are guys, there was actually a piece in the Wall Street Journal, a really, mind-blowing piece about a guy who makes clothes hangers in the United States. And he was facing import competition, and he had this moment where he had to decide whether to kind of lean into foreign production, so engage in some outsourcing for clothes hangers, not really a strategic product, or engage in a bunch of protectionism. And some trade lawyers in Washington convinced him to file a case against China. The problem, of course, is that then production, because this is a very simple product, instantly moved to like Vietnam or wherever. So he had to file another case against Vietnam, and then he had to file another case against India. And now he's in a new case against, I don't know, Mexico, some other low-cost production place. And in the piece, he said he'd spent millions of dollars on trade lawyers, even though his business continued to decline. And, in many such cases, the lawyers always win. Sometimes the domestic producers do too. Sometimes, occasionally, the foreign guys win, but the lawyers always win in these cases.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Scott, for talking about this. His newsletter for The Dispatch called Capitalism comes out every week. Definitely check it out, and check out all the stuff that he's doing at Cato as well. So thanks, Scott. In 2020, when he was running for president, Joe Biden said, "Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore." This is kind of a weird comment from a presidential candidate to specifically call out an economist who, at that point, has been dead for almost 15 years. The idea that Milton Friedman somehow from beyond the grave was running the show previously would come as a shock to Milton Friedman, who, aside from not actually being alive, has been pretty consistently ignored on most of his major policy recommendations for government. If you go back and watch his 1980 television program, Free to Choose, which is available in its entirety on YouTube completely for free, so I'd encourage you to do that. A lot of the problems that he talks about in that show are still problems that we face today. A huge, expansive regulatory state, huge budget deficits, Federal Reserve that isn't quite good enough at doing its job, to put it lightly. But for some reason, people have convinced themselves that Milton Friedman actually has been running the show, and that the government has actually been getting smaller, and that what we've seen in the past several decades is capitalism run loose. Part of this came from the Great Recession, the idea that capitalism had failed, but the idea goes back further than that. And Joe Biden seemed to be one of the people who believed that, and so he said Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore. And then he got elected and he governed that way. Democrats enacted some of the most anti-Milton Friedman policies possible. They went out there, passed major industrial policy programs. They kept Donald Trump's protectionism. Government ran massive budget deficits, as it had done under Trump as well. They created specific subsidy programs for electric vehicles, encouraged more people to take on student debt by subsidizing the cost of that as well and forgiving it for people who already had it. Democrats added about, I shouldn't say Democrats, the Biden administration added about $1.7 trillion of regulatory costs through new final rules in the Federal Register. They passed a massive infrastructure law with Republicans to significantly increase government spending on infrastructure projects. They did lots of things that were for the benefit of organized labor, and yet for some reason, these were people who thought that Milton Friedman was running the show. A lot of those things are just common things that government does all the time. This wasn't necessarily a departure from the normal way of doing things in Washington, D.C. But it was very clear in its rejection of Milton Friedman and of his ideas. Now, one of the things Milton Friedman talked about a lot was monetary policy. Other economists would make fun of him sometimes and say he was too obsessed with the topic and obsessed with inflation. Well, there's a little bit of poetic justice in the fact that Democrats lost the election in no small part because of inflation. The voters really, really hated inflation. Democrats ran unabashedly on an agenda that was anti-Milton Friedman, anti-free market. And voters hated it because of inflation. Now, it wasn't just free market people that were warning about this, by the way. Larry Summers, who was Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary and one of Barack Obama's close economic advisors, he also warned about the potential for inflation when Democrats were passing all these programs. But they didn't listen. They did it anyway. And if you look at exit polling from the election, how much you care about inflation is a pretty good predictor of how likely you were to vote for Donald Trump. Among the 22% of voters who said that inflation caused them severe hardship, Trump won 74-24. Among the 53% of voters who said that inflation caused them moderate hardship, Trump won 51-45. So a little bit closer, but he still had the edge. And then among the 24% who said that inflation caused them no hardship, Harris won 77-20. So huge win for Trump among the people that said inflation hurt them a lot. Huge win for Harris among the people that said inflation didn't hurt them very much. And for the people in the middle, Trump just barely edged her out. That's probably why he won the election. One of the reasons why, anyway. Overall, on voters who said that the most important issue to them was the economy, Trump won 80-19. So this is about as clear rejection of a party's economic policies as you're going to get in an election. Now, I asked before, is Milton Friedman making a comeback? Just because the party that ran against Milton Friedman lost does not necessarily mean Milton Friedman is making a comeback. Obviously, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who won the election, are major protectionists. Friedman would not have been a fan of that. They are opposed to reforming entitlement programs, which is the main problem for the budget deficit, along with interest on the debt. Friedman would not have been a fan of the budget deficits that we've had and will continue to have as long as major reforms are not made. But at the very least, what we've seen is that explicitly and proudly running on the rejection of free markets as a party did not go well for that party on economic policy issues. I think that is something that is a little bit encouraging, at least. But before Milton Friedman is going to make a comeback, he might have his revenge on the Republican Party, too. We'll see if inflation returns because of irresponsible economic policies that Republicans might pursue. But it's important to remember that the truth or accuracy of Milton Friedman's thought is not dependent on how much you hate him. He was a brilliant economist. He had a lot of great ideas. And he had a very, very powerful way of expressing them. And it's a way that still, I think, captures people's imaginations today. You can still see a lot of his video clips go viral online. Stuff that he did in lectures in the 1970s. I think the reason for that is he's actually speaking to something that Americans really get on a gut level. Another thing that Americans get on a gut level is a admiration for agriculture. We like to feel warm and fuzzy about farms. And this is something that is common in most societies, actually. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, you can also sense he has this sort of warm, fuzzy feeling about farms. And one of the things that we like about it is sort of the rugged individualism of farming. The idea that the farmer goes out and works the land, puts in the effort, and gets the crops and the produce that the rest of us can enjoy. Unfortunately, that's not really how it happens. Agriculture in the United States is arguably our most socialistic industry. And I'm not using that term as a way to attack. I'm not using socialist in that sense. I'm using socialist in the literal sense of the government centrally planning economic activity in accordance with ideas of justice or fairness. That is how agriculture is mostly done in the United States. It's also how it's done in a lot of the world. And as a result, all kinds of weird stuff happens. One of those things is that milk is almost never on sale in the United States. Now, this might seem like a really little thing, and it is in the grand scheme of things. But I think it's interesting to think about because of what it tells us about the unintended consequences of economic policy. So, when you go to the grocery store, you'll see stuff that's marked down. There's lots of reasons stores mark things down. One of the reasons is to balance out how much of the product they have with how much people want. So, if the store over-ordered a certain good, they'll mark it down to get rid of it. With perishable food, one reason that it gets marked down is that the expiration date is coming soon. So if it's going to expire in a couple days, you mark it down to get rid of it so that people will see it and say, oh, well, at that price, sure, I'll buy it and I'll just eat it today and don't have to worry about it going bad. Milk is one of the quintessential perishable foods, so you'd expect there to be lots of reasons to mark it down as the expiration date approaches. But as you know, if you go to the grocery store, it's probably hard to remember a time when milk was on sale, no matter what the expiration date was. The price is just the price. A lot of this comes back to government control of agriculture. And as a result of that, even if it's not technically illegal, it's very, very difficult for grocery stores to mark down milk. So, what's the background here? The background is the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration created all sorts of agriculture programs to boost farmers who were struggling. And the farmers absolutely were struggling. That's not in dispute. What should make us a little skeptical is why do we kind of have the same system today as we had in the Great Depression? But the basic idea of these programs was to increase prices. During the Great Depression, there was huge declines in prices. It might sound like it's a good thing, and it is a good thing if you're buying stuff, but it's not a good thing if you're selling stuff. And for farmers, they wanted prices to be higher. And so the government came in all sorts of different ways to increase the prices of agricultural goods. Now, if you want to try to figure out how milk is priced in the United States today, let me tell you, it's extremely complicated. And I'm not qualified to give you a full description. But there's these organizations in the Department of Agriculture called Federal Milk Marketing Orders. Let me think, what is this, the Soviet Union? No, this is the United States. We have Federal Milk Marketing Orders, and they determine the price of different kinds of milk that is used for different purposes by formulas. These are the prices that milk processors are allowed to pay to milk producers. So this isn't the price you pay in the store. But it's a form of price support to make sure that the price of milk does not go below a certain level. And that level is decided by the government based on what they think is good enough for farmers. If you look at the price you actually pay in the store, a lot of times there's state rules that get in the way. So for example, in California government has something that is called the minimum lawful retail price, calculated by a formula based on the invoice price of the milk and the cost of doing business. And they say you are not allowed by law to sell milk below that price. It's another form of price support. Massachusetts has a state law that says that milk dealers are not allowed to sell price at a cost less than the price fixed by the commissioner to be paid for milk so acquired and distributed. That's the exact word from the Massachusetts state code. Lots of states have rules like this that say that you're not allowed to sell milk at below a certain level decided by the government. And so it's very, very hard to mark down milk in the United States, and so most of the time stores simply don't do it. Now, what are the consequences of that? One consequence, if you constantly have a price being pushed up, you're going to encourage more production of that good. It's just common sense. If you know you can make more money from a good, you're going to try to make more of it. And so dairy farmers in the United States regularly overproduce milk. They produce more milk than people could possibly use. And milk goes bad relatively quickly, so it just gets wasted. It gets dumped out. This is a predictable consequence of this government policy. And the government is perfectly fine with it because their goal is to keep the price high. And so anytime the price would go down because there's too much production, they prevent that from happening. So the too much production continues, and we waste a bunch of milk. Also, from the store's perspective, since they can't mark down milk, the milk that they have on the shelf when it passes the expiration date just gets wasted, and they don't have a really effective way to get it out of the store quicker. Now, one of the good things about milk from the grocery store's perspective is that the customer base for it is relatively stable. People make that a routine part of their buying. And so they are able to order pretty close to what people would want. But if they miss or something like that, it's very, very hard for them to get the product off the shelf quickly because they can't mark it down. So we waste a lot of milk. And this is all part of the plan from the government's point of view. Because again, the government is planning this. This is not the free market at work. agriculture is one of our most socialistic industries. And because the government has decided that it's more important for them to keep price supports for dairy farmers, which, by the way, disproportionately benefit the largest dairy farmers at the expense of the smaller ones. Because they have these rules in place, you're not allowed to mark down milk, and we waste a bunch of it. Should be a little bit more humble about what they can plan. Well, now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Scott pick the paper of the episode from the National Bureau of Economic Research in November 2024 by Alexander Klein and Christopher Meissner. Did tariffs make American manufacturing great? New evidence from the Gilded Age. Here's Scott to tell you about it.
There was an excellent new paper just the other week in the National Bureau for Economic Research, NBER, looking at U.S. tariff history and this McKinley era of the late 19th century and U.S. tariff, when U.S. tariffs were very high. Some listeners might recognize that name McKinley because Trump was very fond of bringing President McKinley up and the McKinley tariffs and said crazy things like we were the wealthiest we've ever been. And that's always, that typical Trump nonsense. But you have had in recent months a sort of attempt to repair the reputation of American tariff policy during the 19th century and say that actually it was quite good for the economy and for the manufacturing sector and the rest because, the economy improved. Ergo, correlation equals causation. Tariffs are great. And you've seen this kind of rehab effort going on. So this paper is great because it really dismantles that protectionist theory, the revisionist history of American tariff policy. Now, we already had research on this, to be clear. I mean, I wrote a paper several years ago about American tariff history, and I cited some of this research showing that actually the best you can say is that tariffs didn't really harm the American economy during that period, which was booming for all sorts of non-trade reasons. So these guys, though, they went further. They actually looked at industries protected by tariffs, and they found that these industries actually suffered more than unprotected companies, and they suffered from low labor productivity. In other words, they were not producing more stuff with fewer people. That's kind of the whole point, of an innovative, lean company. They actually saw declines in labor productivity over the period. So, in other words, they posit that the tariffs actually, by encouraging the entry of less productive, smaller enterprises, by creating this kind of captive domestic market, actually made these protected industries weaker than they would have been in the absence of the tariff. So really a great study that looked at that and really undermines the idea that tariffs made America great in the McKinley area. The other thing I would note in this paper, and it wasn't the main point, is they have a really great summary early on about kind of the corrupt nature of American tariff policy in the 19th century. Because that's the other thing people don't seem to understand. One of the reasons why the president has so much tariff power today is because Congress used to set tariffs, and it was just an absolute corrupt mess. And this paper has a really entertaining section on some of the most egregiously corrupt aspects of U.S. tariff policy back then. Aspects that, again, we still see little bits and pieces of, and, like in the exclusion process we just talked about, but back then were, corruption on steroids, right? So really a great paper, highly recommend, and yet further evidence of the problems, both economically and politically, that tariffs have caused for more than a century now.
Did Tariffs Make American Manufacturing Great? By Klein and Meissner. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.